Hi, my name's Riley, and my topic is going to be on the Syrian war. My major claim will be that the destabilization of Syria will only be solved by U.S. intervention. My three supporting claims will be the U.S. were involved in the Syrian conflict, our economy would stabilize and increase. My number two would be about the U.S. being in Syria, the civilians will settle down into peace once again. And my third supporting claim will be terrorist influences will grow if the U.S. fails to act. Back to my first supporting claim. In Syria's economy, picking up the pieces by David Butter. He's the previous regional director of the Middle Eastern region and Economic Intelligence Unit from 2007 to 2012. He states that the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, has taken control of many oil fields and plants, and that these have drastically lowered Syria's oil production and revenue. Because in 2002, 700,000 barrels were produced every day. In 2010, it got reduced to 400,000, and in late 2014, it got reduced to 40,000. And so this has taken a serious toll on their revenue as a country. And if the U.S. took back these terrorist-controlled plants, they can get Syria's economy to take a step in the right direction. Adding this to this is Elena Ianchovicina's statement from, she's the lead economist of the World Bank's Middle Eastern region, saying that the spread of ISIS has disrupted the growth of strong trade in the Middle East, and this is because the oil industry has such a big part to do with the Middle East, because oil is their number one source of revenue. Going to my second supporting claim, by the U.S. being in Syria, the civilians will settle down into peace once again. Based on a survey done by the Washington Post, over half the Syrians polled said they agreed with and condoned U.S. coalition airstrikes. So Syrians want a U.S. presence to help with those terrorizing their homes. And when it's U.S. soldiers fighting for them, they don't have to pick up arms and fight and put themselves in harm's way, like Syria's Kurds militarizing the civilians to fight ISIS themselves. And my third supporting claim is that terrorist influences will grow if the U.S. fails to act. Nader Hashimi, director of Center of Middle Eastern Studies, says that the Syrian conflict is destabilizing the Middle East by many extremists traveling to Syria to support the Islamic State. Roughly 7,000 foreign fighters from 50 different countries have traveled to help them out. So without intervention, the Islamic terrorists are already spreading to other extremists to join their cause. And we need to not only stop their numbers from growing, but dwindle them down to not be such a threat. With the battle going on in Syria, Hashimi also noted that Al-Qaeda has expanded to control more than 400 miles across the Middle East, and not just in one country. This shows that without controlling the threat in Syria, other terrorist organizations are growing more bold and powerful. According to the Huffington Post, Syria has 5 times as much the death toll than the Libya revolution had. Syria has 220,000 deaths compared to 30,000 in Libya. And so in Libya, we eventually joined and we eventually stopped so many deaths happening, and we need to do the same things for Syria. And so through aiding Syria with the United States intervention, we can bring stabilization to Syria's economy with their oil and trade. We stabilize the civilians' unrest while simultaneously helping eliminate any terrorist threats.
All right, the structural things are solid. You've got a clear statement of your proposition. The secondary claims are previewed pretty effectively. I do think on some of the secondary points there are gaps in the arguments that you're making. The notion that restoring the economy is just dependent on getting the oil flowing again. If the oil was flowing before, why did the whole thing become a mess in the first place? I think you're missing some of the underlying issues that were going on that led to the collapse in Syria. It's not just an economic collapse. They didn't just disappear and get into these problems because the oil stopped going. There were problems with the leadership and the government that they had there at the time. There were internal pressures for reform that were not being addressed properly. I mean, it's a very complex issue, and you make it sound like, well, if we just turn the oil back on, everything's going to get better again. And I think that that's an oversimplification of what's happening here. And you know, you've got a couple of other places where that's also a bit of an issue. Your transition to the second point in the body of the speech was relatively clear. I think it needed to be developed a little bit more. The information, for instance, that the United States involvement would be welcome, I understand that. If, you know, hey, if somebody comes along and fights my battle for me, I'm all for that. But is it going to make a difference? Would it be effective? That's the sort of thing that we need to talk about. What would be required in order to effectively fight ISIS and restore some sense of order in Syria? If it's 15,000 troops at a risk, you know, at a very minimal risk, people might say, okay, that's one thing. If it's going to take 500,000 troops and we're going to be there for 25 years, that's another one of those things. Is this something that we want to get involved with? And we're not given much context on what would be required. It's nice that the Syrians support us doing something to try and stabilize and get rid of the people that are doing horrible things, but on the other hand, you know, I'm not exactly sure why we shouldn't be putting arms in the hands of people so they can fight for themselves. Maybe that's one of the problems, though. That's another one of those complications that's going on, those issues. Some of the people that we've armed have turned out to be not so good people, and some of the people we've armed turned out to be not so brave people, and they fled the area because, you know, they're being swamped by all of those foreign fighters that you mentioned that are coming in. So, you know, can we stem the flow from a U.S. presence and involvement there? There are plenty of people who say that we can do that kind of thing. That's the answer that we've got. Some of the candidates for president are talking about. Lindsey Graham, that was the whole thing. He said, look, he's not going to be shy about it. We got to do something here. It's going to hell in a handbasket. It's a miserable situation. I did like the analogy or the comparison that you made to Libya that said, look, we got involved. We made commitment there when there were far fewer people who were being killed on the ground, and we, you know, created something that's a little bit more stable. Why are we not willing to do that here? We should be able to do that here. We have a greater need to do that here. And our failure to act is producing these negative consequences. And I think that would be, like I said, I like that analogy that you're making there. And then there's other people who could be talking about. I did think that all of the sources that you cited, you did a good job giving qualifications for them. You had a lot of credibility to your position as a consequence of that. But they're often talking about things in a more abstract context. In other words, what's the value of the oil? Why is there a trade problem that's going on here? What are all the foreign fighters doing? As opposed to your argument, which is U.S. involvement is going to create stability in trade. It's going to stem the flow of foreign fighters. It's going to result in military victory. That's really the argument you're making, and so you need some information that talks about those kinds of things. And I would think, like, for example, some testimony from military personnel who've assessed the situation and talk about what would be required to be effective in here, and some political people, particularly from the United States, not just the international trade groups that you're talking about, but from the United States talking about that would enhance your argument more. All right, thank you.